On the day my husband of 14 years demanded a divorce, he expected me to wage a bitter war for his $5 million real estate empire. He expected me to cry, to scream, and to beg for custody of our 16-year-old daughter, who was sitting right beside his pregnant 25-year-old mistress. Instead, I calmly signed away every single asset and my parental rights for absolutely free, with only one non-negotiable condition. I wanted full custody of his paralyzed 68-year-old mother. He laughed so hard he choked on his expensive scotch, completely thrilled to be rid of what he called a useless burden. He even wrote me a check for $6,000 to take her off his hands, documenting his abandonment in ink. He had absolutely no idea that his arrogant signature on that piece of paper had just legally stripped him of his entire fortune. My name is Charmaine, and I am 36 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit quietly and let an arrogant narcissist dig his own grave. Trust me, the revenge in this story is served ice cold. The air conditioning in the high-end Atlanta law firm was turned up so high it felt like a meat locker, which was perfectly fitting for the slaughter taking place. Across the massive mahogany conference table sat Darius, my soon-to-be ex-husband. He was wearing a custom-tailored three-piece suit that I had picked out for him last Christmas, leaning back in a plush leather chair with the smug, untouchable aura of a man who believed he owned the world. To his right sat Vanessa, his former junior assistant turned pregnant mistress. She was resting a manicured hand on her barely visible baby bump, shooting me triumphant little smirks. And to his left sat the most painful betrayal of all. Chloe, my own 16-year-old daughter. "Sign the papers!" Charmaine Darius barked, breaking the heavy silence in the room. He grabbed the thick stack of divorce settlement documents and slid them forcefully across the polished wood. They came to a halt right in front of me. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. My lawyers have made it completely bulletproof. You get zero equity in the business, zero claim to the Midtown development, and you walk away from the primary residence. You wanted to play the victim, so now you can go be one somewhere else." I looked down at the documents. As an estate tax consultant, I spent my entire career managing wealth structuring trusts and protecting assets. I had spent the last decade quietly doing the grueling back-end accounting that kept Darius out of federal prison while he played the flashy real estate mogul on social media. He honestly believed his empire was built solely on his own brilliance. "You are claiming all of the marital assets because you say I secretly siphoned funds," I stated, keeping my voice dangerously level. "You and I both know that is a complete fabrication to protect your public image, Darius. You just want to clear the deck for your new family." Vanessa leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the light of the chandelier overhead. "Oh, please, Charmaine. Darius told me how you have been hoarding money in offshore accounts. Just be grateful he is not pressing criminal charges and taking you to court for fraud. He is being generous by just letting you walk away." I ignored her completely and shifted my gaze to my daughter. Chloe was slouching in her chair, aggressively chewing a piece of gum. Resting on the table in front of her was a brand new limited edition Prada bag. It was the exact bag I had told her she needed to save her own allowance to buy, hoping to teach her the value of $1. Vanessa had clearly bought it for her the moment my back was turned, successfully purchasing my daughter's loyalty with designer leather. "Chloe," I said softly, "you do not have to be here for this. You can step out into the lobby." Chloe rolled her eyes dramatically and crossed her arms. "Just sign it, Mom," she said, her voice dripping with the exact same cold entitlement as her father. "I am not a baby anymore. Dad says you are just trying to drag this out to drain his bank accounts. I want to live with Vanessa anyway. She actually understands me and does not treat me like a prisoner. We are going shopping for my new bedroom furniture this afternoon." The words felt like a physical strike to my chest, but I did not let a single emotion cross my face. I had spent 14 years raising her, helping her with homework, sitting by her bed when she had a fever, and trying to mold her into a strong, independent young woman. But Darius had systematically poisoned her mind over the last 6 months, showering her with unrestricted cash and zero rules while painting me as the villain. I took a slow, deep breath. I looked at Darius. I looked at Vanessa. And finally, I looked at the corner of the expansive conference room. Sitting quietly in the shadows, parked in a motorized wheelchair, was Loretta. She was Darius's 68-year-old mother. 3 months ago, the family was told she suffered a minor stroke that left her paralyzed on her right side and completely nonverbal. Since then, Darius had treated her like an embarrassing piece of broken furniture. He complained constantly about the cost of her and home nurses, and how her presence in the mansion ruined the aesthetic of his dinner parties. "Fine," I said, picking up the heavy silver pen provided by the law firm. "I will sign everything exactly as it is written. You can have the house, you can have the cars, you can have full legal and physical custody of Chloe, you can have the business." Darius sat forward, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second, clearly suspicious of how easily I was surrendering millions of dollars. "What is the catch, Charmaine? You never do anything without a catch." "There is one condition," I replied, staring dead into his eyes. "It is non-negotiable. If you do not agree to it right here and now, I will drag this divorce through litigation for the next 5 years. I will demand forensic accounting of every single LLC you own. I will subpoena Vanessa and make her testify about the company funds you used to buy her a condo before we were legally separated." Vanessa physically recoiled, her hand dropping from her stomach. Darius clenched his jaw. "What do you want?" "I want Loretta," I said clearly, pointing the silver pen toward the corner of the room. "I want full legal guardianship and physical custody of your mother. She leaves with me today, and you never contact her again." The room fell into a stunned silence. Even Darius's high-paid lawyer, who had been quietly reviewing emails on his phone, snapped his head up in confusion. Chloe stopped chewing her gum. Then Darius threw his head back and burst into loud, booming laughter. He laughed so hard he had to wipe a tear from his eye. Vanessa joined in, giggling and shaking her head as if I had just told the most hilarious joke in the world. "You want? The old bat?" Darius gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You are walking away from $5 million, and your master plan is to take a crippled, drooling old woman who cannot even feed herself. What are you going to do, Charmaine? Put her to work." "She is your mother, Darius," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "She birthed you. She raised you. And you are ready to discard her just like you discarded me. I am not leaving her in your house to be neglected by your new wife." Vanessa scoffed, checking her nails. "Please. She smells like medicinal cream and stares at the wall all day. It gives me severe anxiety. I told Darius we needed to put her in a state facility before the baby arrives anyway. You are doing us a massive favor." "I am serious, Darius," I said, ignoring the mistress. "Put it in writing, right now. Add an addendum stating that you surrender all caregiving responsibilities and legal guardianship of Loretta to me." Darius was grinning from ear to ear, looking at his lawyer. "Draft it," he commanded immediately. "Draft it before she changes her crazy mind." The lawyer rapidly typed on his laptop, printed a single-page addendum, and slid it over to me. I read every word carefully. It was perfectly ironclad. I signed my name on the custody agreement, the asset forfeiture, and finally, the guardianship transfer. I pushed the stack of papers back across the table. Darius was practically glowing with victory. He reached into the inner pocket of his custom jacket and pulled out his personal checkbook. He clicked his pen and began scribbling rapidly. "You know what, Charmaine? Because I am such a generous guy, and because you are doing me such a huge solid by taking that massive medical bill off my hands, I am going to help you out," he mocked. He ripped the check from the book and tossed it across the table. It fluttered down and landed right in front of me. It was a check for $6,000. "Buy yourself a decent used car to drive her around in," Darius sneered. "Or pay for a few months of her adult diapers. Consider it my final charity to you." I looked closely at the check. Down in the memo line at the bottom left corner, in his distinct aggressive handwriting, he had written the words, "Compensation for taking the burden off my hands." A genuine, chilling smile finally touched my lips. I picked up the check, folded it carefully, and slid it into my blazer pocket. This small piece of paper with those exact arrogant words was the final nail in his coffin. "Thank you, Darius," I said smoothly. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the corner of the room. I unlocked the brakes on Loretta's wheelchair. The older woman stared blankly ahead, not moving a muscle, playing her part flawlessly. "Mom." Chloe called out, a brief flash of hesitation in her voice. "Where are you going to live?" I paused behind the wheelchair and looked at my daughter one last time. "You made your choice, Chloe. Enjoy the Prada bag." I turned the wheelchair around and pushed my mother-in-law out of the conference room, leaving my former family behind to celebrate their supposed victory. They thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. But as the heavy glass doors of the law firm closed behind us, I touched the pocket containing the $6,000 check. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the absolute destruction of Darius's life was about to officially begin. The drive from the law firm back to the sprawling Buckhead estate took exactly 24 minutes. I spent the entire ride in complete silence with my hands wrapped tightly around the leather steering wheel of my SUV. Loretta sat in the passenger seat. Her head was tilted slightly toward the window, maintaining the perfect illusion of a broken-down old woman. The afternoon sun caught the reflection of the massive wrought iron gates as they swung open for what would be my final time. This was the house I had spent the last 10 years turning into a home. I had picked out the imported Italian marble for the foyer. I had personally designed the landscaping. Darius only ever cared about the optics of the address. He viewed the mansion as a giant billboard for his massive ego. I parked in the circular driveway. My plan was simple. I had 3 hours before Darius and Vanessa returned from their victory lunch. I needed to pack my essential clothing, gather my important business files from the home office, and collect all of Loretta's personal belongings from her ground floor suite. I walked around to the passenger side, unfolded the wheelchair, and carefully transferred my mother-in-law into it. I pushed her up the custom accessibility ramp I had forced Darius to install just 3 months ago. The moment I unlocked the heavy oak front door and pushed the wheelchair into the grand foyer, I knew something was horribly wrong. The house was supposed to be completely empty. The maids had been given the afternoon off. But I could hear the distinct sound of metal clinking and wooden drawers slamming coming directly from the east wing. It was coming from Loretta's private suite. I pushed the wheelchair quietly down the long hallway. The door to the bedroom was wide open. I stopped in the doorway and felt a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. Standing in the middle of the room were Tasha and Jamal. Tasha was Darius's younger sister, a woman whose entire personality revolved around wearing designer clothes she could never afford, and complaining about how the world owed her a lavish living. Jamal, her husband, was a hulking man who boldly called himself a luxury commercial contractor, but had never actually bothered to pass the state licensing exam. He relied entirely on Darius to toss him scraps and unpermitted jobs from his commercial projects. Right now, the two of them were tearing through a sick woman's room like common thieves at a neighborhood yard sale. Tasha had her oversized Louis Vuitton tote bag resting right on the bed. She was violently yanking open the velvet-lined drawers of Loretta's antique mahogany jewelry armoire. Several heavy silver serving platters, heirloom pieces that had been in the family for generations, were already shoved unceremoniously into the designer bag. Jamal was on his knees, aggressively pulling vintage hat boxes out from under the bed, tossing them aside when he realized they only contained old family photographs. "Excuse me," I said loudly. My voice cracked like a whip in the quiet room. Tasha gasped and dropped a string of heavy pearls onto the carpet. Jamal bumped his head against the solid bed frame as he scrambled to his feet. For a split second, they both looked like deer caught in headlights. But Tasha quickly recovered, puffing out her chest and putting her hands on her hips. She looked at me, then looked down at the wheelchair where her own mother sat completely motionless. "What the hell are you doing here, Charmaine?" Tasha demanded, her voice shrill and defensive. "Darius just texted the family group chat. He said you signed the divorce papers and you are officially out of the family. You have absolutely no right to be in this house." "I am here to pack my things and collect your mother," I replied, my eyes darting to the stolen silver peeking out of her bag. "What exactly are you doing, Tasha? Because from where I am standing, it looks like you are robbing a paralyzed woman blind before her bed is even cold." Tasha scoffed loudly and rolled her eyes. Do not act like you are on some moral high ground. We are simply securing our family heirlooms before you try to fence them at a local pawn shop. Darius told us you demanded to take the old lady. We all know exactly why you did it, you pathetic gold digger. I raised an eyebrow. Really? And why is that? Because you are broke, Tasha sneered, taking a bold step closer to me. You walked away from the business because you knew my brother had you cornered legally. Now you are scrambling. You figured if you take my mother, you can cash her monthly Social Security and disability checks. You want to use her as your personal ATM to pay your rent. You are disgusting, Charmaine. The sheer psychological projection was almost laughable. Tasha was the exact woman who had begged me for a $40,000 loan 3 years ago to keep her out of jail for severe credit card fraud. A loan she conveniently forgot to ever pay back. I had quietly covered her tracks and balanced the books to save the family name. And now, she was boldly accusing me of stealing a measly disability check. Put the jewelry back, Tasha, I commanded calmly. All of it, right now. Jamal stepped forward, placing his massive frame directly between his wife and me. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his sheer physical height to intimidate me. Listen to me very carefully, Charmaine, Jamal growled, pointing a thick finger right in my face. You are not part of this family anymore. You are a trespasser. Darius gave us direct permission to clear out this room today. You are going to turn that wheelchair around, walk out the front door, and never come back. If you take one more step into this room, I am calling the Atlanta Police Department and having you arrested for breaking and entering. I looked at Jamal's finger hovering just inches from my nose. I did not flinch. I did not step back. Instead, I let out a low, slow chuckle that seemed to deeply unsettle him. You are going to call the police, Jamal, I asked, tilting my head slightly. Are you absolutely sure you want to invite law enforcement into your life today? Or better yet, maybe we should invite the city building inspector instead. Jamal's arm dropped slightly, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. What are you talking about? I reached into the front pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. I calmly unlocked the screen and opened my secure email application. As the lead financial consultant for Darius's development firm, I oversaw all the back-end corporate accounting, which meant I saw every single invoice, every purchase order, and every shady deal Jamal ever tried to push through the system. Let us talk about the midtown luxury condos you are currently framing for Darius, I said, tapping the glass screen. The ones being actively marketed to the public as ultra-premium, fire-resistant luxury living. Yesterday afternoon, while I was doing a final audit of the corporate accounts, I noticed a very interesting discrepancy between the materials requisition forms and the actual shipping manifest from your supplier down in Florida. Jamal's face lost a fraction of its color. Tasha looked between her husband and me, her arrogant confidence suddenly faltering. I tapped a PDF attachment on my screen. I have an email right here from your supplier. It clearly details that you canceled the order for the commercial-grade fire-retardant drywall required by federal safety code. Instead, you purchased 3 truckloads of unpermitted cheap residential gypsum board from a shady liquidator. You pocketed the $80,000 difference. Installed the cheap drywall and submitted completely falsified compliance documents to the city inspector. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy. Jamal stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open. Do you know what the legal penalty is for falsifying federal safety compliance documents on a commercial build, Jamal? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. It is a major felony. It carries a minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison, not a local county jail. Federal prison. And that is before the massive civil lawsuits from the city when they force you to tear down a $50 million building to replace the walls. Darius will completely throw you under the bus the second the city finds out. He will claim you acted entirely alone, and we both know he has the expensive lawyers to prove it. Jamal swallowed hard. His imposing posture completely collapsed. He looked like a deflated balloon. Tasha was staring at him in sheer, unadulterated panic, suddenly realizing that her husband's greed was about to destroy her entire comfortable lifestyle. I hovered my thumb right over the send icon on my screen. This email is already drafted to the Chief Building Inspector of Atlanta with the shipping manifests and the falsified invoices attached. I can hit send right now. Or you can empty that Louis Vuitton bag onto the bed, take your husband by his hand, and walk out of this house before I ruin both of your lives permanently. Tasha looked at the heavy bag, then looked at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. But fear quickly won out. With shaking hands, she grabbed the leather handles of her bag and violently upended it over the mattress. The heavy silver platters, the string of pearls, and a velvet box containing Loretta's vintage diamond brooch tumbled out onto the white duvet cover. "Let us go, Jamal," Tasha hissed, grabbing her husband's arm. She refused to make eye contact with me as they scurried toward the door like cockroaches fleeing from a kitchen light. Jamal kept his head down, his broad shoulders hunched as he squeezed past the wheelchair. They practically ran down the hardwood hallway, and a few seconds later the heavy front door slammed shut, echoing through the empty mansion. I stood in the quiet room looking at the precious jewelry scattered across the bed. Then I looked down at Loretta. She had not moved a single muscle during the entire heated altercation, maintaining her vacant stare flawlessly. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. "I am so sorry you had to see that, Loretta," I said softly. I walked over to the bed, carefully picked up the pearl necklace, and placed it back into its protective velvet box. I spent the next 2 hours efficiently packing everything of value in that room. I packed her vintage clothing, her medical supplies, and her irreplaceable family heirlooms into heavy-duty suitcases. I did not touch a single item that belonged to Darius. I only took what was rightfully hers and my own personal financial files from the office upstairs. When the trunk of my SUV was finally fully loaded, I wheeled Loretta out of the bedroom. We moved through the grand foyer past the Italian marble and the crystal chandeliers that I had meticulously maintained for over a decade. I did not look back once. There was nothing left in that house but ghosts and lies. I pushed the wheelchair down the custom ramp and secured Loretta securely into the passenger seat of my car. I loaded the heavy chair into the back, slammed the trunk shut, and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine, put the car in drive, and rolled down the long driveway. The massive wrought iron gates closed behind us with a loud, definitive metallic clank. The disgraceful exit was complete. The scavengers had been swatted away. As I merged onto the busy highway heading toward my new modest apartment across town, I felt a strange sense of absolute mental clarity. The storm was rapidly coming for Darius and his entire parasitic family, and they had absolutely no idea that the quiet, compliant woman they had just discarded was the exact one orchestrating the hurricane. The drive across town ended in front of a modest brick apartment building nestled in a quiet working-class neighborhood. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling estates of Buckhead, but to me it looked like absolute freedom. I parked my SUV in the assigned spot, walked around to the passenger side, and helped Loretta back into her wheelchair. I pushed her up the concrete ramp, navigated the narrow hallway, and finally unlocked the door to Unit 4B. I pushed the wheelchair inside and kicked the heavy wooden door shut behind us. I turned the deadbolt until it clicked solidly into place. I threw the security chain across the track. The moment that lock engaged, the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of Darius and his toxic family instantly vanished. The air in my two-bedroom apartment felt incredibly light and clean. There were no crystal chandeliers or imported marble floors here. There were no massive oil paintings or pretentious sculptures bought purely to impress wealthy investors. There was just a comfortable beige sofa, a small wooden dining table, and a kitchen that actually smelled like fresh coffee instead of expensive catered food and bitter resentment. Every single item in this space belonged to me. I had purchased it with my own money, earned through my own hard work. It was small, but it was a fortress of absolute peace. I walked over to the windows and pulled the curtains completely shut, ensuring nobody from the outside could see into the living room. Then I turned around and looked at the woman sitting motionless in the center of the floor. "We are safe, Loretta," I said quietly. "You can drop the act now." The frail, paralyzed woman, who had not spoken a single word or moved a single muscle in 3 months, suddenly took a deep breath. Loretta calmly reached down with her supposedly dead right hand and unbuckled the nylon safety strap across her waist. She planted both of her feet firmly on the hardwood floor and stood up. She stretched her back, rolled her shoulders, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Lord have mercy," Loretta said, her voice clear, strong, and completely devoid of any neurological damage. "Playing a vegetable is the hardest work I have ever done in my entire life. My lower back is absolutely killing me." She did not stumble. She did not limp. Loretta walked perfectly upright past me, moving with the grace and authority she had possessed her entire life. She headed straight for the small kitchen island, opened the top cabinet, and pulled out 2 large wine glasses. She reached for the bottle of expensive red wine I had left breathing on the counter. She poured generous amounts into both glasses, walked back over and handed one directly to me. "To freedom," Loretta said, raising her glass with a sharp, calculating gleam in her dark eyes. "To the trap," I replied, clinking my glass against hers. The crisp, dry wine tasted like absolute victory. Loretta took a long sip and walked over to the dining table. She looked nothing like the pathetic burden Darius thought he had discarded at the law firm earlier today. The stroke had been a completely calculated performance. 3 months ago, Loretta discovered that Darius was actively bribing doctors to declare her mentally incompetent. He wanted to throw her into a cheap state-run nursing home so he could gain total control over her personal finances and liquidate her vintage jewelry collection to fund Vanessa's extravagant shopping habits. When Loretta came to me in tears with this horrifying information, we realized we had to act immediately. We hired a private out-of-state physician to fake her medical records, claim she suffered a debilitating stroke, and render her entirely mute. It was the only way to keep her physically inside the mansion while I meticulously gathered the financial evidence we needed to destroy him. "You played your part perfectly today," Charmaine Loretta said, setting her wine glass down on the table. "When Tasha and Jamal were ripping through my bedroom, it took every ounce of strength I had not to jump up and slap my own daughter across her face. Seeing her steal my silver was heartbreaking, but knowing what we are about to do to them makes it entirely worth it." I walked over to my heavy-duty suitcase and unzipped the main compartment. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder containing hundreds of pages of legal documents, bank statements, and property deeds. I carried the heavy stack over to the dining table and spread the papers out across the wooden surface. "Let us review the exact status of his so-called empire," I said, pulling up a chair beside her. Loretta nodded, her expression hardening into pure business. "Darius thinks he is a self-made titan. He struts around Atlanta giving interviews about how he built his luxury real estate development firm from the ground up with nothing but his own sweat and brilliance. But we both know the absolute truth. Every single piece of land he develops, including that massive new $50 million Midtown project, is built on soil owned entirely by the Loretta Family Irrevocable Trust." She tapped a finger firmly on the original property deed from 40 years ago. "My grandfather bought hundreds of acres of undeveloped commercial land back when nobody wanted it. When he passed away, he put it all into a highly protected trust. 10 years ago, when Darius wanted to start his company, I gave him a general power of attorney. I allowed him to lease the land from the trust for pennies so he could secure his massive construction loans. He built the shiny buildings, but the trust owns the dirt underneath them." I pulled out the specific power of attorney document Darius had proudly waved in my face during a previous argument. "He assumes this piece of paper gives him supreme authority over the trust," I explained, tracing the dense legal jargon with my pen. "He thinks because he is the primary designated beneficiary and holds this proxy, he can leverage the land however he wants. He uses the trust's pristine credit rating to secure loans while keeping the actual assets shielded from his own personal liability. He assumes the trust is simply his personal piggy bank waiting for your eventual death to fully vest into his own bank accounts. He does not realize that 5 years ago, when I first caught him funneling company money into his private offshore accounts, I advised you to restructure the trust entirely." Loretta smiled, a predatory expression that looked exactly like the one Darius used when he thought he had won. "Yes. We quietly revoked his general power of attorney regarding the land itself and replaced it with a highly conditional proxy. We legally embedded a morality and guardianship clause into the foundation of the trust. A clause he never bothered to read because he was too arrogant to believe a woman could outsmart him. The morality clause was my absolute masterpiece as an estate tax consultant. It explicitly stated that if Darius, as the primary beneficiary, ever committed an act of elder abuse, financial neglect, or legally abandoned his mother, his beneficiary status would be immediately and permanently revoked. The trust would automatically transfer all assets, including the land leases, to the secondary beneficiary, which was me. But to trigger that clause, we needed undeniable, legally binding proof of abandonment, Loretta stated, leaning forward and resting her elbows on the table. We needed him to document his refusal to care for me. And getting a narcissist to put his cruelty in writing is not easy. Did he do it? Did he take the bait at the law firm today? I reached into the pocket of my blazer, feeling the crisp paper against my fingertips. I pulled out the folded piece of paper. I smoothed it out, carefully flattening the deep creases, and placed it right in the center of the table, directly on top of the original trust documents. The blue ink from his expensive fountain pen stood out sharply against the white background. He signed it, I said softly. Loretta leaned in and read the check. She saw the $6,000 amount. Then her eyes dropped to the memo line. She read the words out loud, her voice echoing in the quiet apartment. Compensation for taking the burden off my hands. A cold, chilling laugh escaped Loretta's lips. She picked up the check and examined Darius's aggressive signature. He actually wrote it. My own son sold his $50 million empire for $6,000 because he wanted to impress his mistress and insult my daughter-in-law. He legally documented his refusal to provide care. He explicitly called his own mother a burden he was paying to remove. This check is a legally binding admission of elder abandonment. It is more than that, I added, tapping the printed date on the check. Because he signed this today, the morality clause is already technically triggered. The Midtown land he is currently using as collateral for his massive federal construction loan no longer belongs to him. He does not have the legal right to build on it, which means the paperwork he just submitted to the bank is entirely fraudulent. Loretta placed the check back down on the table with a terrifying sense of finality. We let him dig his own grave for 3 months. We let him abuse us, dismiss us, and throw us out like garbage. And now he has handed us the exact shovel we need to bury him completely. I poured myself another small splash of wine. The trap is officially set. Tomorrow morning, I will take this check directly to the senior trust attorney at the bank. We will formally initiate the transfer of assets. But we are not going to tell Darius. We are going to let him continue to build his Midtown project. We are going to let him spend millions of dollars of investor money on land he no longer owns. We will let him climb as high as he possibly can so the fall completely destroys him. Loretta raised her glass to me one more time. You are a brilliant woman, Charmaine. I am deeply sorry my son was too blind to see your value, but I am incredibly proud to call you my daughter. We finished our wine in comfortable silence, surrounded by the legal documents that would soon decimate my ex-husband's life. The first phase of our plan was flawlessly executed. But I knew Darius. I knew his massive ego, and I knew his vicious temper. The moment he faced even a slight inconvenience, he would lash out. The war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And the next attack was going to come from the person who hurt me the most. The morning sun filtered through the cheap blinds of my new apartment. I woke up at exactly 6 o'clock, a habit ingrained in me from years of managing a demanding consultancy firm. The silence of the small apartment was a stark contrast to the chaotic mornings at the Buckhead estate. There were no landscapers running leaf blowers outside and no aggressive demands from Darius. I walked into the kitchen and found Loretta already awake, sitting comfortably at the small dining table. She was sipping black coffee and reading the morning financial news on her tablet, looking sharper and more vibrant than she had in months. We exchanged a knowing smile. We had a massive mission today, and the energy in the room was electric. I poured myself a cup of coffee and began mentally preparing my strategy for the bank meeting. I needed to ensure the senior trust attorney processed Darius's check, immediately locking the morality clause into place. But just as I sat down to review my legal files, my cell phone began to vibrate violently across the wooden table. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen. It was Chloe. My chest tightened instantly. Despite everything she had said at the law firm yesterday, she was still my daughter. A mother's instinct does not simply vanish overnight. I took a deep breath, hoping against hope that she was calling to apologize. I swiped the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello, Chloe," I said softly. "Mom, you need to transfer $2,000 to my checking account right now," Chloe demanded. There was absolutely no greeting, no hesitation, and certainly no apology in her voice. The cold entitlement hit me like a physical blow. I am standing at the insurance agency, and they are refusing to issue the policy for my new car until the premium is paid in full. Dad bought me the Mercedes yesterday, just like he promised, but he said the auto insurance is technically a daily living expense which falls under your financial obligations. So send the money. I closed my eyes and pinched the bridge of my nose. Darius was playing his usual manipulative games. He had spent over $100,000 on a luxury sports car for a 16-year-old girl just to buy her affection and look like the hero. But he was too cheap to pay the ongoing maintenance costs, intentionally dumping the financial burden on me. "Chloe," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly calm. "I no longer have access to the joint family accounts. Your father made sure of that yesterday. Furthermore, you explicitly stated that you wanted to live with him and Vanessa. If he bought you a luxury car, he can pay the insurance premium to keep it legally on the road." A loud, exaggerated scoff echoed through the phone speaker. It was not Chloe. It was Vanessa. The mistress was clearly standing right next to my daughter, listening to the entire conversation on speakerphone. "Oh, please," Charmaine Vanessa's shrill voice pierced through the audio. "Stop acting like a broke victim. We all know you run a highly successful consultancy firm. You can easily afford a simple insurance premium for your own daughter. But I guess now that you live in some ghetto apartment with a crippled old lady, you are trying to hoard every single penny you can scrub together. It is honestly pathetic that you are punishing Chloe just because you are jealous of my new life." I gripped the edge of the dining table so hard my knuckles turned completely white. Loretta looked up from her tablet, her dark eyes narrowing dangerously as she heard Vanessa's toxic voice echoing from the phone. I took a slow sip of my coffee, refusing to let them hear even a fraction of an emotional reaction. "Vanessa," I said, my tone dropping to a deadly icy register. "You really should be careful about throwing around words like pathetic and jealous. Let us be entirely clear about who and what you are. 2 years ago, you were a struggling junior assistant fetching coffee for the partners at Darius's firm. You could barely afford the rent on your studio apartment, and you constantly begged the accounting department for salary advances. You saw a wealthy, married man with a massive ego, and you intentionally stopped taking your birth control. You got pregnant on purpose to secure a financial bag because you lacked the basic intelligence and work ethic to build a career of your own. Do not ever speak to me about hoarding pennies. You are nothing but a temporary parasite feeding off a host." I could hear Vanessa gasp loudly on the other end of the line, completely humiliated by the blunt, unfiltered truth being exposed right in front of Chloe. "Mom, stop it!" Chloe shouted aggressively, defending the woman who was actively destroying our family. "Vanessa is going to be my stepmother, and she actually cares about my happiness. Dad told me you would act exactly like this. He told me you would be bitter and try to ruin my gift. If you do not transfer the $2,000 right now, I am going to tell Dad, and he will make you regret it. Send the money, Mom. Now." The sheer disrespect in my daughter's voice broke the last remaining string of patience I had left. Darius had successfully weaponized her, turning my own child into a greedy stranger. "I am not sending you a single dime, Chloe," I stated with absolute unwavering finality. "I am not funding your father's manipulative gifts, and I am certainly not subsidizing the extravagant lifestyle of his pregnant mistress. You wanted to play the role of an independent adult who makes her own choices. Well, welcome to adulthood. Bills have to be paid, and luxury items come with heavy responsibilities. When you finally learn the actual value of a dollar, And when you are ready to speak to me with the respect I deserve as your mother, you can call me back. Until then, you can ask your new best friend Vanessa to pay your insurance premium out of her allowance." Before Chloe could scream another insult, I pulled my phone away from my ear. But I did not hang up just yet. I opened my banking application, navigated directly to the authorized user management page, and selected Chloe's Platinum credit card. The card had a $20,000 limit that I personally guaranteed and paid off every single month. With one swift tap of my finger, I permanently canceled the account. I put the phone back to my ear just in time to hear the automated notification chime on Chloe's end. "What did you just do?" Chloe demanded, her voice suddenly laced with genuine panic. "I did what a responsible parent should have done months ago," I replied coldly. "I cut off your Platinum card. You no longer have access to my credit line. Have a wonderful day at the insurance agency, Chloe." I tapped the red button and ended the call, cutting off her screaming. The silence returned to the kitchen. Loretta was staring at me with a mixture of deep sympathy and immense pride. "It is the hardest thing in the world to discipline a child who has been poisoned against you," Loretta said softly. "But you did the exact right thing. She needs to feel the harsh reality of her father's empty promises." I nodded, swallowing the thick lump of sorrow in my throat. I had to stay focused. Less than 3 minutes later, my phone began to ring again. This time, the caller ID displayed Darius's name. Chloe had obviously called him crying about the canceled credit card. I let it ring 4 times before I finally answered. "Charmaine, what the hell is your problem?" Darius roared, his voice vibrating with rage. "How dare you insult Vanessa and cut off Chloe's card? If you do not reactivate it now, I will destroy your business. I will completely blacklist your consultancy firm among Atlanta's elite." I listened to his furious threats, feeling nothing but pity for his ignorance. He truly believed he held all the power. He had absolutely no idea the ground beneath him had already crumbled. "Are you finished, Darius?" I asked smoothly. "Do what you have to do." "Because I am doing exactly what I have to do." I hung up the phone before he could unleash another threat. I engaged airplane mode, cutting off any further communication. I grabbed my leather briefcase containing the trust documents and the $6,000 check. I gave Loretta a final determined look, then walked out. I drove through the busy Atlanta traffic, my mind razor sharp. 15 minutes later, I pulled into the First Federal Bank of Georgia parking lot. The war was officially transitioning to the boardroom, and I was about to drop a legal bomb Darius would never see coming. The heavy glass doors of the First Federal Bank of Georgia slid open with a quiet whoosh. I stepped into the cavernous marble lobby, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. This was not the retail banking branch where everyday customers deposited their paychecks. This was the private wealth management sector, a heavily guarded sanctuary where generational fortunes were protected, multiplied, and sometimes legally dismantled. I bypassed the main teller line and walked directly toward the frosted glass double doors at the far end of the atrium. A security guard in a tailored suit recognized me immediately and gave a respectful nod, swiping his keycard to grant me access to the executive suites. I walked down the hushed, carpeted hallway until I reached the corner office belonging to Jonathan Sterling, the senior trust attorney who had managed the Loretta family irrevocable trust for the past 2 decades. Jonathan was a meticulous man in his late 60s, possessing a razor-sharp legal mind and a deep abiding respect for my mother-in-law. When my assistant called him an hour ago to request an emergency meeting, he had cleared his entire morning schedule. I opened the door and found him standing behind his massive oak desk, reviewing the thick physical file of the trust. He looked up, his silver wire-rimmed glasses catching the morning light, and gestured for me to take a seat in one of the plush leather chairs opposite him. "Charmaine," Jonathan said, his voice grave and completely devoid of pleasantries. "You indicated on the phone that the triggering event has occurred. Are you absolutely certain?" I did not waste time with small talk. I unclasped my leather briefcase, reached inside, and pulled out the folded piece of paper Darius had so arrogantly tossed at me yesterday. I placed the check exactly in the center of Jonathan's pristine desk blotter. "I am completely certain, Jonathan," I replied evenly. "Darius formalized the abandonment yesterday afternoon during the divorce settlement signing. Jonathan leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he peered at the blue ink. He studied the $6,000 amount, then his eyes locked onto the memo line. He read the words in complete silence. Compensation for taking the burden off my hands. A heavy sigh escaped Jonathan's lips. He leaned back in his chair, taking off his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. For 10 years. I have watched that boy treat his mother's legacy like his own personal playground, Jonathan murmured, shaking his head in absolute disgust. I knew he was arrogant, but I never imagined he would be foolish enough to explicitly document elder abandonment on a bank-drafted instrument. This is not just a moral failing, Charmaine. This is a definitive legal forfeiture. Exactly, I stated, leaning forward to tap my index finger against the heavy trust file resting on his desk. 5 years ago, when we restructured the foundation of this trust, we embedded the morality and guardianship clause for this exact scenario. Section 4, paragraph B, clearly stipulates that if the primary beneficiary refuses to provide adequate medical care, financially neglects, or legally abandons the grantor, all beneficiary rights are immediately terminated. By writing this check and specifically labeling his paralyzed mother a burden he is paying to remove, Darius has provided undeniable, irrefutable proof of abandonment. Jonathan picked up the check, handling it as if it were a loaded weapon. He walked over to his high-resolution scanner and processed the document directly into the bank's secure legal mainframe. The moment this image hits the system, the shift in power is absolute. Jonathan explained, his tone shifting into pure aggressive litigation mode. Darius is officially stripped of his beneficiary status. He no longer has any legal claim to the trust assets, the cash reserves, or the commercial land leases. As the designated secondary beneficiary, you are now the sole controlling authority of the Loretta Family Irrevocable Trust. The land his entire real estate empire sits on now belongs entirely to you. I felt a deep, powerful surge of adrenaline rush through my veins. Do not notify him yet, I instructed sharply. Darius is currently finalizing a $50 million federal construction loan for his new Midtown luxury complex. He is using the trust's commercial land as the primary collateral for that loan. I want him to proceed. I want him to sign the federal loan documents under the false assumption that he still owns the collateral. Jonathan paused, looking at me with a mixture of shock and profound professional respect. If he signs federal bank documents pledging collateral he no longer owns, he will be committing massive bank fraud, Jonathan warned. The federal government does not take loan fraud lightly. He could face decades in prison. He made his choices, I replied coldly, snapping my briefcase shut. Put a silent freeze on the trust assets. Flag the Midtown property deed in the internal banking system so it requires a manual override and a fresh signature from Loretta to proceed with any new liens. But whatever you do, keep Darius completely in the dark until the trap snaps shut. Jonathan nodded slowly, typing a rapid series of commands into his secure terminal. The silent freeze is active, he confirmed. He has no idea he just lost everything. While I was calmly dismantling his empire in the quiet sanctuary of the wealth management office, Darius was throwing a massive, chaotic celebration halfway across the city. His luxury commercial development firm occupied the entire top floor of a glass skyscraper overlooking downtown Atlanta. The expansive office was currently packed with investors, local politicians, and sycophantic employees holding expensive glasses of champagne. They were celebrating the official groundbreaking of the Midtown complex, the crown jewel of his supposed real estate dynasty. Darius stood at the front of the room wearing a custom suit that cost more than most people made in a year. Vanessa was clinging tightly to his arm, wearing a tight designer dress that aggressively highlighted her pregnancy. She was loudly boasting to a group of wealthy wives about the exclusive private school she had already selected for the unborn child. Across the room, Jamal and Tasha were aggressively raiding the catered seafood buffet, stuffing their faces with lobster and acting as though they personally owned the company. Thank you all for coming today, Darius announced, his booming voice echoing across the room as he raised his champagne flute. People told me a project of this magnitude was impossible. They told me I was overreaching. But I built this firm from the ground up through pure sweat, blood, and unmatched vision. Today, we secure the $50 million federal loan, and tomorrow, we break ground on the future of Atlanta. The room erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. Darius flashed his $1 million smile, drinking in the adoration. He truly believed he was invincible. He believed discarding his mother and discarding me had completely freed him to ascend to the top of the financial world. But his celebration was abruptly cut short. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open, and his lead financial officer, a nervous man named Richard, rushed into the room. Richard was sweating profusely, clutching a sleek digital tablet to his chest. He aggressively pushed his way through the crowd of celebrating investors, ignoring the angry glares from the politicians. He grabbed Darius by the arm and pulled him away from the cheering crowd, dragging him into the soundproof glass walls of his private corner office. "What is wrong with you, Darius?" hissed angrily, violently, yanking his arm away the second the glass door closed behind them. "We are in the middle of a massive press event. We have a massive problem with the first federal loan." Richard stammered, his hands shaking as he held up the tablet. "The commercial lending department just kicked back our final approval documents. They placed a hard administrative hold on the $50 million transfer." Darius narrowed his eyes, his arrogant smile instantly vanishing. "What do you mean they kicked it back?" "The loan was fully approved last week. The collateral is rock solid. The trust land is worth at least $20 million alone. The bank's internal underwriting system just flagged the property deed," Richard explained, swiping frantically on the screen to pull up the urgent email from the bank. "Because the land technically still belongs to the Loretta family irrevocable trust, and because of a recent automated security audit, the bank is demanding a fresh, physical signature from the original grantor to authorize the new lien. Your general power of attorney is being temporarily rejected by their compliance software. They need your mother to physically sign the release documents in blue ink today, or the entire $50 million loan defaults before it even funds." Darius stared at the tablet, his face turning an angry mottled shade of red. "If the loan defaults, the construction crews walk off the site tomorrow. The investors panic. The entire project collapses, dragging his entire company into immediate bankruptcy." He had intentionally bragged to the press, committing millions of dollars he did not actually have yet, completely reliant on the trust land to bail him out. "Where are the release documents?" Darius demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, violent pitch. Richard scrambled to hand over a thick manila envelope. "Right here." "But Darius, your mother had a severe stroke. She is paralyzed and nonverbal. How is she supposed to legally sign a commercial banking document if the bank finds out she is mentally incapacitated? They will freeze the trust entirely." "You let me worry about my mother," Darius snarled, snatching the envelope out of Richard's trembling hands. "You go back out there and keep those investors drunk and happy. Do not say a single word about this holdup." Darius stormed out of the private office, his eyes frantically scanning the crowded party until he spotted his sister and brother-in-law. He marched straight over to the buffet table, grabbed Jamal by the collar of his expensive shirt, and yanked him away from the shrimp cocktail. Tasha gasped, dropping her plate as Darius dragged them both into the empty hallway near the elevators. "Listen to me very carefully," Darius hissed, shoving the manila envelope hard into Jamal's chest. "I just hit a massive roadblock with the bank. They need the old bat's physical signature on these land release forms today, or my entire company goes under." Jamal looked down at the envelope, his eyes widening in panic. "But Charmaine took her yesterday. She kicked us out of the Buckhead house and took her to some cheap apartment. We do not even know where they live." "Then you better find out!" Darius roared, slamming his fist against the metal elevator door, causing Tasha to jump back in terror. "You call every leasing office in the city. You track her license plate. You do whatever it takes. I do not care if she is paralyzed. I do not care if she cannot speak. You find Charmaine's apartment, you get inside, and you force my mother's hand around a pen. Get that signature by any means necessary, or I swear to God, Jamal, I will hand over the falsified drywall invoices to the police myself and send you to federal prison. Now get out of my sight and go find them." Atlanta's late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the immaculate parking lot of the artisanal grocery store in Decatur. Inside the brightly lit aisles, I was pushing a sleek silver cart, carefully selecting heirloom tomatoes, fresh organic basil, and imported Italian pasta. Loretta had requested a comforting homemade meal to celebrate our morning victory at the bank, and I was more than happy to oblige. The heavy, suffocating burden of my 14-year marriage was completely gone, replaced by a sharp, focused energy that buzzed through my veins. My phone was still securely set to airplane mode, shielding me from the inevitable barrage of panicked calls and threatening text messages from Darius. I paid for my groceries, exchanged a pleasant, genuine smile with the young cashier, and walked out through the automatic sliding glass doors into the humid Georgia air. I approached my SUV, unlocked the doors with a press of my key fob, and lifted the rear trunk to load the heavy paper bags. For the first time in over a decade, I felt completely in control of my own destiny. The morality clause was actively freezing Darius's assets, and all I had to do was remain patient while his empire crumbled. That fleeting illusion of peaceful control shattered the very second a massive matte black Range Rover swerved violently into the parking lane. Its massive tires screeched loudly against the hot asphalt, leaving dark rubber marks behind. The heavy vehicle stopped at a harsh diagonal angle, completely blocking my SUV from backing out of the parking space, before the powerful engine even cut off. The passenger side door flew open. Tasha stormed out, her designer stiletto heels clicking frantically against the pavement. She was still wearing the expensive tight cocktail dress from Darius's groundbreaking celebration, but her face was twisted in an ugly, desperate sneer. Jamal emerged from the driver's side a split second later, slamming his door so hard the tinted glass rattled in its frame. He looked absolutely furious, the thick veins in his muscular neck bulging prominently against his tight dress shirt collar. I slowly lowered the trunk door of my car, turning my body to face them fully. I did not reach for my phone to call for help. I simply stood my ground, maintaining a posture of absolute calm. "Where is my mother?" Tasha shrieked at the top of her lungs, marching right up to me and aggressively jabbing a manicured finger into my personal space. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, and she reeked of expensive champagne mixed with desperate, undeniable panic. We have been driving around the city for 2 solid hours, checking every single cheap apartment complex on the east side. "Where did you hide her, Charmaine?" I took a slow, deliberate step back, resting my lower back against the cool metal bumper of my car. "I am not hiding anyone." "Tasha," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Your mother is exactly where she wants to be right now. She is safe, she is comfortable, and most importantly, she is completely away from you and your brother." Tasha let out a loud, mocking laugh that sounded far more like a feral bark than a display of humor. "Safe," she echoed sarcastically. "You took a paralyzed, defenseless woman out of a luxury-gated estate just to spite my brother during a divorce settlement. You have always been a manipulative, scheming outsider, Charmaine. Ever since Darius was foolish enough to marry you, you have done absolutely nothing but try to ruin our family dynamic. You always thought you were so much better than the rest of us, just because you have some fancy financial degree and run a successful consultancy firm. You systematically alienated Darius from his own blood relatives, and now you are literally kidnapping our disabled mother just to drain her monthly social security checks. You are a toxic gold-digging parasite." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her wild accusations made the blood in my veins run icy cold. "Tasha," I said, dropping my tone to a dangerously low articulate register that demanded immediate silence. "Are you actually going to stand in the middle of a public parking lot and lecture me about family loyalty and being toxic? Let us take a quick, honest trip down memory lane, shall we? 3 years ago, when you secretly opened 5 different premium credit cards, using your own mother's social security number, who was the one who discovered the fraud? It was me. When you rapidly racked up $40,000 in completely fraudulent charges, buying designer handbags and booking luxury vacations to Miami for you and your friends who covered up your massive crime, it was me. Darius wanted to hand you right over to the federal authorities instantly to protect his own pristine public image. He was completely ready and willing to let his own little sister go to federal prison for felony identity theft. I was the one who quietly pulled $40,000 out of my own personal savings account to pay off the banks in full. I was the one who hired the expensive corporate lawyers to quietly scrub your financial record clean before the authorities could officially press charges. I kept you out of a cold jail cell, Tasha. You owe me your entire freedom, and you do not have the right to speak to me this way ever again. Tasha's face instantly turned a violent, embarrassed shade of crimson. She opened her mouth to scream another vicious insult, but she had absolutely no defense prepared. The blunt reality of the truth was a heavy physical weapon, and it had completely disarmed her false bravado. She looked around nervously, suddenly hyper-aware of the few shoppers walking past our vehicles and casting curious glances in our direction. Jamal had clearly heard enough of the history lesson. He pushed roughly past his humiliated wife, his massive, imposing frame, blocking out the afternoon sun as he stepped directly into my immediate physical space. He did not care about old credit card debt, and he certainly did not care about family history. He only cared about saving his own skin and his shady contracting business from Darius's impending wrath. He reached out swiftly with his thick, heavy hand and violently grabbed my left upper arm. His strong fingers dug painfully deep into my flesh, physically pinning me backwards against the cold metal trunk of my car. "Listen to me right now, you arrogant witch!" Jamal growled, leaning forward until his face was mere inches from mine. "I do not care about any of that ancient history right now. Darius is currently facing a $50 million federal default. The bank is demanding a fresh physical signature from Loretta today to release the trust land collateral." He used his free hand to reach into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a crumpled, thick manila envelope. He shoved it forcefully against my chest, crushing the paper against my collarbone. "Do you see this envelope, Charmaine? These are the official bank release documents. If Darius loses this massive construction loan, my entire commercial contracting business goes completely under with him. I will lose everything, and I am absolutely not letting you ruin my life over a petty divorce dispute." I tried to pull my arm away from his grasp, but his grip was locked like an iron vice. "Jamal, let go of me right this second," I said, intentionally letting a slight tremor enter my voice to sell the performance. "What you are doing is physical assault. You cannot legally force a medically incapacitated, paralyzed woman to sign a binding financial document. The federal bank executives will easily recognize that her signature was entirely coerced. You are talking about committing federal bank fraud." Jamal leaned in even closer, his breath hot, aggressive, and reeking of desperation. "We are not asking for your unsolicited legal advice, Charmaine. We are coming to your new apartment tonight. You are going to pull out your phone and text me the exact address right now. And you are going to have that old lady sitting up at the dining table with a pen securely in her hand, completely ready to sign these release papers the second we walk through the door. If you try to call the police or if you refuse to let us inside the building, things are going to get very ugly and very painful for you. Accidents happen to vulnerable women living alone all the time in this city. Do you clearly understand me?" I looked up into Jamal's furious, unblinking eyes. I then looked over at Tasha, who was now smiling smugly, entirely empowered and validated by her husband's blatant physical threat against me. They truly thought they had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner. They believed that brute force and aggressive intimidation were more than enough to break my spirit and force my absolute compliance. I desperately needed them to believe exactly that. I needed them to feel completely invincible, so they would confidently commit the ultimate unforgivable crime on camera later tonight. "Okay," I whispered softly, letting my shoulders slump forward in a display of complete, utter defeat. I purposefully widened my eyes, forcing a highly convincing look of absolute terror onto my face. I let out a shaky, uneven breath, acting as though my entire tough, independent facade had completely crumbled under the weight of Jamal's violent threat. "Please just let go of my arm. You are hurting me. I will text you the address right now. I will have her completely ready for you tonight. Just please do not hurt us." Jamal smirked widely, his massive, fragile ego instantly inflated to the breaking point by my calculated display of deep fear. He finally released my bruised arm with a rough, dismissive shove that sent me stumbling slightly against my vehicle. "Good girl," he sneered down at me with ultimate contempt. "Be ready and waiting at exactly 8 o'clock tonight." He aggressively grabbed Tasha's hand, and the two of them strutted back to their luxury Range Rover like victorious conquering heroes who had just won a major war. They climbed inside, slammed their doors, reversed aggressively out of the lane, and sped out of the grocery store parking lot, running a stop sign in their desperate haste. I stood completely alone by my car for a long moment, gently rubbing the sore red marks on my arm where his thick fingers had dug in. As the loud sound of their powerful engine faded away into the distance, the terrified, broken expression on my face completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a cold, highly calculating smile. They thought they had just forced my hand, but in reality, they were walking blindly and willingly straight into my flawless trap. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of focused adrenaline. I carried the heavy paper grocery bags up the stairs to the fourth floor, my mind calculating every single variable of the upcoming confrontation. When I unlocked the door to Unit 4B, the rich smell of brewing tea filled the air. Loretta was standing by the window looking out over the quiet neighborhood street. I set the groceries on the kitchen island and immediately began explaining the encounter in the parking lot. I told her about Jamal's physical threat and Tasha's desperate, unhinged behavior. Loretta did not flinch or show an ounce of fear. Instead, a grim, determined smile spread across her face. We had less than 3 hours to set the ultimate stage. Our enemies were bringing the legal weapon right to our front door, and we simply had to ensure the environment was perfectly primed to capture their crime. I walked over to the small bookshelf positioned in the corner of the living room. Nestled between a row of thick financial textbooks and a decorative ceramic vase was a high-definition motion-activated security camera. I had purchased it weeks ago, knowing that Darius or his cronies would eventually try to physically intimidate me. I synced the device to my smartphone, checking the live video feed. The wide-angle lens perfectly captured the front door, the entire living room, and the small dining table. The audio reception was crystal clear. I adjusted the angle slightly to ensure the tabletop was in sharp focus. Every single word, every threat, and every physical action would be recorded and securely uploaded to an encrypted cloud server in real time. There would be absolutely no way for Jamal or Tasha to deny what they were about to do. To make the scene look entirely natural and domestic, I went into the kitchen and began preparing dinner. I chopped the heirloom tomatoes and fresh basil, boiling the imported pasta, while Loretta sat at the dining table. We spoke quietly about the future, about the massive empire that would soon be wiped clean of Darius's toxic influence. As the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the living room floor, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. The light, celebratory mood from the morning vanished, replaced by a thick, heavy tension. At 7:45, Loretta stood up, smoothed out her sweater, and walked over to her motorized wheelchair. She sat down, strapped herself in, and instantly transformed. Her vibrant posture collapsed, her bright, intelligent eyes glazed over, staring blankly at the wall. Her right hand fell limply into her lap. She was no longer the sharp matriarch of a real estate dynasty. She was a helpless, paralyzed victim. At exactly 8 o'clock, heavy footsteps echoed loudly in the narrow, quiet hallway outside my apartment. They did not even bother to knock. I heard the aggressive scratching of a metal tool sliding against the cheap locking mechanism of my front door. Jamal was a contractor, and bypassing a standard residential deadbolt was child's play for him. A loud metallic crack rang out, and the heavy wooden door was violently shoved open, slamming hard against the interior drywall. Jamal and Tasha stormed into my living room, bringing a chaotic, violent energy into my safe sanctuary. Jamal kicked the door shut behind him, engaging the deadbolt to trap us inside. Tasha looked around my modest apartment with absolute disgust, wrinkling her nose as if the very air was beneath her. "Well, look at this depressing little box," Tasha sneered, her eyes darting from the beige sofa to the small kitchen. "You gave up a massive mansion in Buckhead to live in this pathetic dump. You really are a complete loser, Charmaine." But Jamal ignored her petty insults. He was sweating heavily, his eyes wild with desperate panic. He marched straight past me and slammed the thick manila envelope onto the center of my dining table. The loud smack made me jump, a genuine reaction to his massive, imposing presence. He ripped the envelope open and pulled out a stack of dense legal banking documents. The First Federal Bank of Georgia logo was printed boldly at the top of the pages. "Get her over here right now," Jamal barked, pointing a thick finger at Loretta. "I do not have time for games tonight, Charmaine. Darius is losing his mind, and my business is on the line. We need her signature on the bottom of page 7, page 9, and page 12. I stepped forward, placing my body firmly between the dining table and Loretta's wheelchair. I held my hands up in a defensive posture, ensuring my voice was loud and clear for the hidden microphone to pick up. "Jamal, you cannot do this," I pleaded, injecting my tone with a heavy dose of manufactured terror. "You are trespassing in my home. What you are holding are federal banking documents releasing highly valuable commercial land collateral. Loretta had a severe medical emergency. She is mentally incapacitated and physically paralyzed. She does not possess the legal capacity to understand or sign a binding contract." Jamal took a menacing step toward me, his chest puffed out aggressively. "Shut your mouth," he growled. "I do not care about her mental capacity. I care about getting this $50 million loan funded by tomorrow morning. Move out of the way." I stood my ground, shaking my head frantically. "If you force a mentally incapacitated elderly woman to sign those papers, you are committing severe federal fraud and elder abuse," I warned, explicitly stating the legal charges for the camera. "The bank will eventually find out. You and Darius will both go to federal prison. Please just leave my apartment before you ruin your own lives." My legal warning was the absolute last straw for his fragile, crumbling patience. Jamal let out a furious roar, lunging forward with terrifying speed. He raised his massive hands and violently shoved me square in the chest. The sheer physical force of the blow lifted me off my feet. I flew backward, crashing hard onto the hardwood floor. My shoulder slammed against the wooden leg of the sofa, sending a sharp spike of genuine pain radiating down my arm. I gasped for air, clutching my chest as I scrambled backwards, pressing my back against the fabric of the couch. I looked up, wearing a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. Jamal stood over me, his fists clenched, chest heaving. "Stay down, you pathetic witch," he spat viciously. With me physically neutralized on the floor, Tasha saw her opening. She grabbed a black ink pen from her designer purse and confidently marched over to her own mother. Loretta was performing her role flawlessly. Her head was slumped forward, her mouth slightly open, and a small tremor shook her shoulders, as if she were terrified by the loud violence. Tasha did not show a single ounce of empathy or hesitation. She did not ask her mother if she was okay. She simply grabbed the back of the wheelchair and roughly shoved it forward until Loretta was pressed tight against the edge of the dining table. "Wake up, Mom," Tasha hissed coldly, showing zero compassion for the woman who gave her life. "We are saving the family business today." Jamal flipped the heavy banking documents open to the 7th page, aggressively tapping his thick finger next to the signature line. "Sign it right there," he commanded. Loretta kept her eyes glazed, letting out a soft, incoherent moan. Her right arm remained entirely limp in her lap. Tasha let out an annoyed sigh. "She cannot even hold the pen, Jamal. I am going to have to do it for her." Tasha leaned over, grabbing her mother's paralyzed right hand. She aggressively pried Loretta's fingers apart, forcefully shoving the thick barrel of the pen into her palm. Tasha wrapped her own manicured fingers tightly over her mother's hand, establishing an iron grip. I watched from the floor, my heart pounding in my chest, as the ultimate crime was actively committed right in front of the hidden camera lens. Tasha physically guided her mother's trembling hand down to the paper. With sheer brute force, she dragged the pen across the signature line, forging her mother's name in shaky, uneven cursive. She flipped to the 9th page and repeated the violent process, completely overriding any physical resistance her mother offered. She flipped to the 12th page and forced the final signature. The coerced transfer of millions of dollars in commercial land collateral was officially complete. Tasha dropped her mother's hand in disgust, letting the paralyzed limb fall heavily onto the wooden table. "We got it," Tasha announced triumphantly, snatching the signed documents off the table and shoving them back into the manila envelope. She looked down at her mother with a chilling look of utter disdain. "You finally did something useful for this family." Jamal let out a deep, relieved breath, the tension leaving his massive shoulders. He turned and looked down at me, still sitting defensively on the floor. He let out a dark, mocking laugh that echoed through the small room. "You thought you were so smart," Charmaine Jamal sneered, stepping closer to me. "You thought you could use the old lady to hold us hostage and ruin Darius. But you are nothing. You have always been nothing. Next time you try to play in the big leagues, remember who actually runs this city." Tasha walked over to stand right beside her husband. She looked down at me, her eyes filled with toxic superiority. "Enjoy your miserable broke life in this disgusting little apartment," she said. To add a final layer of utter disrespect, Tasha gathered saliva in her mouth and spit forcefully onto the hardwood floor right next to my shoes. Then, she turned on her designer heel and strutted toward the door. Jamal followed close behind, securely clutching the envelope containing their doom. They stepped out into the hallway, pulling the broken wooden door shut behind them. The locking mechanism clicked uselessly, but the sound of their heavy footsteps quickly faded away down the corridor. I remained seated on the floor for a long moment, listening to the absolute silence of the apartment. I waited until I heard the distant sound of the building's front door closing. I slowly pushed myself up off the hardwood, brushing the dust off my jeans. I rubbed my sore shoulder, wincing slightly at the lingering pain from Jamal's violent shove. I walked over to the kitchen island, grabbed a paper towel, and calmly wiped Tasha's spit off my floor, throwing the garbage away. Then I turned around and looked at Loretta. She was still sitting in her wheelchair at the dining table. Slowly, she lifted her head. The blank, vacant stare vanished instantly. Her sharp, intelligent eyes met mine across the room. She looked down at her right hand where the faint indent of the pen still lingered on her skin. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and checked the encrypted video feed. The file had perfectly uploaded. Every threat, every shove, and every forced stroke of the pen was captured in glorious high-definition audio and video. Loretta unbuckled her safety strap, stood up from the wheelchair, and walked over to the kitchen to pour us another glass of wine. "Did you see the look on her face when she forced my hand?" Loretta asked, a huge, genuine smile breaking across her face. I nodded, a soft chuckle escaping my lips. "They think they just saved his $50 million project," I replied, my laugh growing louder. "They have absolutely no idea what they just signed." Loretta handed me a glass of wine, and the two of us stood in the middle of my small apartment, completely alone, and began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, but it quickly grew into a loud, joyous, uncontrollable roar of absolute victory. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had completely decimated them, and they were the ones who happily pulled the trigger. The laughter eventually subsided, leaving a charged electric energy in the apartment. I walked over to the corner of the living room, reaching behind the large potted fern that sat next to my bookshelf. My fingers brushed against the cool plastic casing of the hidden 4K security camera. I pulled it from its leafy camouflage, the small red recording light still blinking steadily in the dim room. I tapped the screen of my smartphone, officially ending the recording and securely locking the video file behind a dual encryption firewall. I turned back to face Loretta, holding the small black cube up like a hard-won trophy. "We have everything," I said, feeling a rush of pure adrenaline. "We have the forced entry, the verbal threats, the physical assault, and the explicit coercion. They are completely trapped." Loretta was still sitting at the dining table, her eyes sparkling with sharp amusement. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a sleek black ink pen. It was the exact same pen Tasha had forced into her hand just moments ago, during the chaotic struggle. Tasha had been so focused on getting the signature and escaping that she did not notice Loretta subtly swapping the pen she brought with one I had strategically left lying on the table. Loretta held the pen up, twirling it elegantly between her fingers. "Do you want to know the best part about this little prop, Charmaine?" she asked, a wicked smile playing on her lips. "It is filled with specialized architect ink. It is designed for drafting temporary blueprints. Within 48 hours, depending on the humidity and exposure to light, the ink completely evaporates into thin air. By the time the bank's internal auditors process those physical documents next week, they will be looking at blank pages." I leaned against the kitchen island, crossing my arms in sheer admiration. "That is brilliant. I admitted, genuinely impressed by her flawless execution of such a subtle detail. You always think 3 steps ahead of everyone else in this greedy family. I am completely amazed by your incredibly sharp mind. But even if the ink does not fade in time, it does not matter. The trap was already inescapable before they even kicked the door open. Loretta nodded, her expression shifting back to that of a calculating matriarch. Exactly. Tasha was so confident in her ability to physically overpower me that she did not stop to think about the legal mechanics of what she was actually doing. She forged the signature I have used for the past 40 years. It is the signature on my old driver's license, my old tax returns, and the original trust documents. But as we planned, I legally changed my official signature 6 months ago when we restructured the trust. I filed the new signature card directly with the federal bank, the state registry, and my personal attorneys. The signature Tasha just violently forced onto those release documents is a legally obsolete, unregistered forgery. They handed the bank a forged document using an invalid signature and fading ink to release collateral they no longer have any legal right to touch. I summarized, shaking my head at the sheer magnitude of their stupidity. And we have them committing the forgery on ultra-high-definition video. Loretta took a final sip of her wine. Let Darius have his morning victory, she said softly. Let him sign the federal paperwork. Because the higher he climbs on his throne of lies, the harder he is going to shatter when he hits the ground. The next morning in downtown Atlanta brought a massive thunderstorm, the dark clouds and heavy rain perfectly masking the incoming destruction. Inside the towering glass and steel headquarters of the First Federal Bank of Georgia, the atmosphere was entirely different. Darius strutted through the expansive polished marble lobby like a conquering emperor returning from a glorious war. He was wearing a brand new custom-tailored navy blue suit, his posture radiating aggressive confidence. He did not look like a man who had just ordered his brother-in-law to assault a woman. He looked like a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted the entire financial system. Jamal was walking a few steps behind him, carrying his leather briefcase. Jamal looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes and a tense, nervous energy radiating from his massive frame. He had barely slept, terrified that I might have called the police after the home invasion. But when morning came and no squad cars appeared at his house, he assumed I had been successfully broken into silent submission. They took the private executive elevator up to the 40th floor, stepping out into a hushed reception area offering panoramic views of the stormy city skyline. A sharp-dressed receptionist immediately escorted them into a massive glass-walled conference room. Sitting at the long mahogany table were 3 senior commercial lending executives and the bank's chief underwriting officer. They were flanked by a stack of thick legal binders representing the final $50 million construction loan agreement. Gentleman, Darius announced loudly, clapping his hands together as he entered the room. I apologize for the minor administrative delay yesterday. You know how unpredictable elderly parents can be with their health, but I promised you the release documents and I always deliver on my promises. Darius turned to Jamal and snapped his fingers impatiently. Jamal quickly opened his briefcase, his hands trembling slightly, and pulled out the crumpled manila envelope. He handed it to Darius, avoiding eye contact with the banking executives. Darius pulled out the signed transfer deeds and confidently slid them across the polished mahogany table toward the chief underwriting officer. The executive adjusted his glasses and carefully reviewed the documents. He flipped to page 7, verifying the blue ink signature. He checked page 9 and finally page 12. To the naked eye, it looked like a standard completed authorization. The executive had no idea the signature was legally obsolete or that the ink was already beginning its slow chemical process of fading away. He simply saw the required ink on the required line. Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Vance, the executive stated, stamping a heavy red approval seal on the front page of the packet. We can now proceed with the final execution of the loan. As you know, by signing this master agreement, you are legally certifying that all collateral listed is free, clear, and accurately represented. Any misrepresentation of these assets constitutes federal bank fraud. Darius did not even blink. He let out a condescending chuckle, completely unbothered by the standard federal warning. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his expensive gold fountain pen. My assets are perfectly secure, he replied smoothly. Let us get this done. I have a $50 million midtown project to build and my construction crews are waiting for the green light. The executive slid the massive final contract across the table. Darius leaned forward, pressing his gold pen to the thick parchment paper. He signed his name with an aggressive, sweeping flourish on the first line. He initialed the second page. He signed the final guarantee on the last page, legally binding himself and his entire corporate entity to the federal loan. He handed the contract back to the executives with a massive, triumphant grin. Congratulations, the chief underwriting officer said, shaking Darius's hand firmly. The $50 million funds will be released into your corporate accounts by the end of the business day. You are officially cleared to begin construction. Darius walked out of the conference room and stepped into the private elevator, letting out a loud, victorious shout the second the doors closed. He aggressively slapped Jamal on the back, nearly knocking the larger man off balance. We did it, Jamal Darius yelled, his eyes wild with greed and power. We beat the system. We own the city. Charmaine is rotting in her cheap apartment. My mother is completely out of the way, and I just secured the biggest deal of my entire life. Jamal let out a shaky breath, finally allowing himself to smile. For a moment, they both truly believed they had won. They believed their brutal tactics and complete lack of morality had elevated them to the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's elite society. But Darius was completely wrong. He had not beaten the system. He had just voluntarily walked directly into a federal trap and locked the heavy steel door behind him. By submitting those coerced, forged documents to release land, he had technically lost the day before. And by signing a federal loan guarantee based on that fraudulent collateral, he had just crossed the point of no return. He was no longer just a terrible husband or a cruel son. He was officially a high-level federal criminal. The ink was drying on his doom, and the explosive countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. 2 weeks slipped by in a quiet, deceptive calm. For Darius, those 14 days were a triumphant parade of arrogance. The federal funds had cleared the bank without a single red flag, depositing $50 million directly into his corporate accounts. He immediately ramped up his lavish lifestyle, acting as if the money belonged to him personally rather than being a highly leveraged construction loan. To celebrate his perceived invincibility, he organized a massive, highly publicized charity gala. It was a massive vanity project designed to announce the groundbreaking of his midtown complex to the elite politicians and wealthy investors of Atlanta. Inside the master suite of the Buckhead mansion, the atmosphere was a chaotic whirlwind of shallow vanity and toxic entitlement. Vanessa stood in the center of the massive walk-in closet, examining her reflection in a floor-to-ceiling gilded mirror. She was wearing a custom-ordered $15,000 silk gown that aggressively hugged her pregnant figure. The dress was dripping in hand-sewn crystals, a blatant display of stolen wealth. Vanessa was in a terrible mood, loudly screaming at the event caterer over her diamond-studded phone. I explicitly ordered the imported beluga caviar and the Maine lobster puffs. Vanessa shrieked, her face turning red. Do not tell me there is a supply chain issue. You work for Darius. You find the lobster. Or I will personally make sure your catering company never works another high society event in this city again. She angrily ended the call and tossed the phone onto a velvet ottoman. Across the room, Chloe mirrored her new stepmother's horrific behavior. My 16-year-old daughter was standing on a small wooden pedestal, while an elderly seamstress knelt on the floor, desperately trying to pin the hem of Chloe's ridiculously expensive designer cocktail dress. Chloe looked down at the working woman with absolute unfiltered disgust, holding a glass of sparkling water. Are you completely blind? Chloe snapped aggressively, jerking her leg away from the seamstress. If I trip on this hem tonight, my father will sue your tailoring shop into bankruptcy. Fix it right now and stop breathing so heavily on my shoes. The elderly woman kept her head down, her hands shaking slightly as she hurriedly adjusted the silver pins. Darius strolled into the closet a moment later, completely ignoring the blatant abuse of the hired help. He wore a sharp black tuxedo and held a glass of scotch. You both look absolutely incredible. Darius announced, taking a sip of his drink and admiring his own reflection in the mirror alongside his mistress. Tonight is the night everything changes for us. The mayor is going to be there. The governor sent a representative. When I step onto that stage and unveil the architectural models for the Midtown complex, the entire city will know that I am the undisputed king of Atlanta real estate. Nobody can touch us. Vanessa smiled wickedly, walking over to wrap her arms around his neck. And Charmaine is probably sitting in her depressing little apartment, clipping coupons and feeding her crippled old mother-in-law. She mocked loudly. Darius laughed heartily, pressing a kiss to Vanessa's cheek. Let her rot. She walked away from an empire for absolutely nothing. Now let us get moving. The press is waiting for our grand arrival. The scene inside my private consultancy office across town was completely different. There were no champagne flutes, no crystal gowns, and absolutely no delusions of grandeur. The environment was completely sterile, quiet, and aggressively focused on the cold, hard application of federal law. I sat at the head of my sleek conference table, wearing a tailored charcoal gray business suit. Sitting immediately to my right was Jonathan Sterling, the senior trust attorney. Sitting across from us were two stern, highly decorated investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent Thompson and Special Agent Reynolds. The blinds were drawn tightly shut, and the only light in the room came from the glow of my large flat-screen monitor. We were watching the 4K security footage from my apartment. The video played in total silence, but the visual violence was overwhelmingly loud. On the screen, the massive frame of Jamal lunged forward violently, shoving me backward onto the hardwood floor. The camera perfectly captured the brutal impact, my shoulders slamming against the sofa leg. Special Agent Thompson clenched his jaw tightly as he watched the assault. The video continued playing. Tasha marched into the frame, aggressively grabbing Loretta's paralyzed hand. She forced her mother's fingers around the architect pen and violently dragged her hand across the bank release documents, forging the signature 3 separate times. I paused the video exactly on the frame where Tasha smiled triumphantly at her forgery. I turned the monitor to face the federal agents. This occurred 2 weeks ago, exactly 14 hours before Darius submitted the executed documents to the First Federal Bank of Georgia. I stated calmly, keeping my emotions entirely detached from the traumatic footage. Special Agent Reynolds opened a thick evidence folder. He pulled out the original bank documents sealed inside clear plastic evidence bags. He slid them across the table for Jonathan and me to see. When we executed the subpoena at the bank 3 days ago, we seized the physical documents, Reynolds explained. Just as you predicted, the specialized architect ink had completely evaporated. The signature lines are completely blank. The bank's internal auditors were absolutely horrified. They authorized a $50 million transfer based on vanishing ink. But the disappearing ink is just the icing on the cake, Agent Thompson added, leaning forward and folding his hands on the table. He looked directly at me with a profound sense of professional respect. You delivered an absolute masterpiece of evidence, Charmaine. We cross-referenced the timestamp on your security footage with the bank's digital submission logs. We have Darius submitting the documents. We have Jamal threatening physical violence to secure them. We have Tasha committing the actual forgery and elder abuse. And we have the morality clause proving Darius did not even own the collateral he was leveraging in the first place, Jonathan chimed in, tapping his pen against his legal pad. It is a completely airtight conspiracy. Thompson nodded, pulling a stack of blue folders from his briefcase. He laid them out on the table one by one. These are the official federal indictments. The grand jury convened quietly yesterday afternoon. It took them less than 20 minutes to return a true bill on every single charge. We have federal arrest warrants signed by a United States district judge. He tapped the first folder. Darius is being charged with massive wire fraud, federal bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit forgery. He is facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison. He tapped the second folder. Jamal is being charged with federal conspiracy, physical assault, and breaking and entering. He tapped the third folder. Tasha is being charged with elder abuse, aggravated identity theft, and forgery. They are all going down, Charmaine. We are executing the raid tonight. We have heavily armed federal teams standing by, completely ready to breach the Buckhead mansion. I looked down at the blue folders containing the absolute destruction of the people who had tortured me. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. I did not want them arrested quietly in the privacy of their mansion. I did not want them to have the dignity of a private surrender. Darius had spent his entire life building a fake, arrogant public image. He had invited the entire city to watch him ascend to his imaginary throne tonight. It was only fitting that the entire city watched his violent, humiliating downfall. "Actually, Agent Thompson," I said smoothly, leaning back in my leather chair and resting my hands on the table. "They are not at the mansion right now. They are currently at the Grand Atrium downtown. Darius is hosting a massive, highly publicized charity gala to announce his Midtown project to the press, the mayor, and hundreds of his wealthiest investors. He believes tonight is his ultimate coronation." Thompson raised an eyebrow, a slight predatory smile touching the corner of his mouth. "A public venue. That complicates the tactical approach, but it certainly maximizes the impact. We can redirect the arrest teams to the Grand Atrium immediately. We will lock down all the exits and take them into federal custody right in the middle of their little party." I stood up from my chair, smoothing the wrinkles from my suit jacket. "I have one final request, gentlemen, a personal favor if you will allow it." Agent Reynolds looked up. "What is it?" "Let me be the one to tell him he is completely ruined." I requested, my voice steady and utterly devoid of mercy. "I want to walk into that ballroom and stand in front of the mayor, the press, and every single investor he desperately wanted to impress. I want him to look into my eyes and know exactly who orchestrated his total destruction before you put the steel handcuffs on his wrists. Let me deliver the fatal blow." Thompson looked at Reynolds, then looked back at me. He slowly closed the evidence folder. "You set the trap, Charmaine. You earned the right to spring it. We will be right behind you. Let us go crash a party." The Grand Atrium in downtown Atlanta was a monument to excessive wealth and unbridled vanity. As the federal convoy navigated silently through the dark, rain-slicked streets toward the venue, the scene inside the ballroom was a masterclass in glittering deception. The massive hall was decorated to mirror Darius's inflated ego. Towering ice sculptures carved into the shape of skyscrapers dominated the center of the room, slowly melting under the heat of thousands of crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos wove seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with the exact imported beluga caviar and Maine lobster puffs Vanessa had so viciously demanded earlier that evening. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of Atlanta's most powerful and influential figures. The mayor was standing near the grand sweeping staircase, chatting animatedly with a group of state senators. High-profile real estate moguls, wealthy angel investors, and a swarm of local media reporters completely filled the opulent space. Everyone was there to witness the birth of a new corporate dynasty. The air smelled of expensive perfume-aged scotch and the distinct intoxicating scent of limitless money. Right at the edge of the velvet-roped VIP section, directly in front of the main stage, stood Jamal and Tasha. They were absolutely drowning in their own manufactured hubris. Jamal was sweating profusely through his custom-tailored suit, clutching a massive glass of top-tier champagne like it was a lifeline. He was loudly recounting an exaggerated version of his commercial contracting prowess to a circle of wealthy, bored-looking investors. He boldly claimed that the Midtown project was entirely his engineering masterpiece, conveniently leaving out the fact that he was completely unlicensed. Tasha was hanging off his arm, her eyes darting frantically around the room to ensure people were adequately admiring her designer gown. She was aggressively mocking my absence to anyone polite enough to listen to her toxic rambling. Oh, Darius's ex-wife was simply too bitter and embarrassed to attend tonight. Tasha practically shouted over the smooth jazz music playing from the live orchestra in the corner. She could not handle the fact that my brother finally traded up to a real woman. Charmaine is currently sitting in a tiny roach-infested apartment across town, pretending to be some brilliant financial guru while she changes adult diapers for my sick mother. It is honestly tragic what uncontrollable jealousy does to a woman. The wealthy wives standing around her offered tight, uncomfortable smiles, completely unaware that the woman Tasha was so viciously insulting had just orchestrated a massive federal raid on this exact building. Tasha took a long gulp of her champagne, leaning into Jamal and whispering about how they were going to buy a yacht with their cut of the construction funds. They believed they were utterly untouchable. Up on the elevated stage, hovering near the silver microphone stand, Vanessa was giving the performance of a lifetime. She had perfectly morphed from the screaming, abusive mistress who verbally attacked the catering staff into the picture of demure, glowing grace. She was strategically positioning herself so the press photographers could capture the perfect angle of her $15,000 crystal gown and her prominent pregnant belly. She kept placing a gentle, protective hand over her stomach, accepting warm congratulations from the city's elite with a practiced, bashful smile. "Oh, Darius worked so incredibly hard for our family," Vanessa cooed to a prominent lifestyle journalist, her voice dripping with fake humility and practiced charm. "He is truly a visionary leader. He carries the heavy weight of this entire city on his broad shoulders, but he still manages to be such a loving, devoted partner. I am just so incredibly blessed to stand beside a self-made titan. I do not know how he does it all without breaking a sweat." It was a sickening display of synchronized delusion. They had completely convinced themselves that their lies were the absolute truth. They had built a massive house of cards on a foundation of stolen land, forged signatures and horrific elder abuse, and they genuinely believed it would stand forever. Vanessa waved to Chloe, who was sitting in the front row acting entirely bored, rolling her eyes at the waitstaff while playing on her new phone. The perfect fake family was on full display for the cameras. At exactly 9 o'clock, the main lights in the grand ballroom slowly dimmed, leaving only the bright, blinding spotlights focused directly on the main stage. The live orchestra swelled, playing a triumphant cinematic overture that vibrated through the floorboards. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause as Darius strode confidently out from behind the heavy velvet curtains. He walked up to the clear acrylic podium, bathing in the rapid flashes of the press cameras. He looked like the absolute king of the world, offering sharp waves and pointing at familiar faces in the crowd. He waited patiently for the applause to die down, letting the dramatic silence stretch just long enough to ensure every single eye in the vast room was locked completely onto him. "Thank you, Darius," began his deep, booming voice, echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Thank you all for joining me on this truly monumental night. When I look out into this incredible crowd, I see the bright future of Atlanta. And I am incredibly proud to say that I am the man building it." He paused, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of completely manufactured earnestness. "People often ask me what my secret is. They ask how I managed to secure a $50 million project that will permanently reshape the skyline of this great city. They want to know who handed me the golden ticket to success." Darius gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward aggressively into the microphone. "Let me tell you the absolute truth tonight," he declared loudly, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Nobody gave me anything. I did not inherit a massive fortune. I did not rely on family handouts, secret trust funds, or lucky breaks. I built this entire empire with my own two bare hands. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps through pure grit, blood, sweat, and unmatched determination. I took the massive financial risks when everyone else was too terrified to step up. Every single brick, every single acre, and every single dollar in my portfolio exists solely because of my own hard work." The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering. He stood there in front of the entire city and completely erased his mother. He erased the generations of wealth her family had carefully preserved to buy that commercial land. He erased the decade I spent protecting him from his own financial incompetence, balancing his books, and saving him from ruin. He claimed ultimate, godlike credit for an empire built entirely on stolen soil and forged documents, and the crowd absolutely ate it up. They began clapping and cheering enthusiastically at the inspiring, distinctly American narrative of the rugged self-made billionaire overcoming all odds. Darius soaked in the roaring adoration, a massive, arrogant smile stretching across his face. He signaled to a waiter. who rushed up to the stage and handed him a crystal flute filled with the most expensive champagne in the building. Vanessa glided over to stand right by his side, resting her head on his shoulder and smiling radiantly for the flashing cameras. Jamal and Tasha stood up in the front row, cheering louder than anyone else, raising their own glasses high into the air. Darius raised his crystal flute toward the ceiling, demanding silence for his final crowning statement. To the Midtown complex, Darius proclaimed loudly, "And to the unstoppable empire that I have built." Just as the crowd drew a collective breath to echo his triumphant toast, a deafening echoing boom shattered the atmosphere. The massive heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom were violently thrown wide open. They crashed so hard against the marble walls that the sound echoed like a gunshot over the sound system. The live orchestra, startled by the sudden aggressive noise, stopped playing mid-note. The beautiful jazz music died instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. Every single head in the massive, cavernous, perfectly decorated room turned simultaneously toward the main back entrance, eyes wide open with sudden, unexpected confusion. Darius lowered his expensive crystal champagne glass very slowly, his deeply arrogant, victorious smile visibly and painfully faltering. He squinted angrily past the blinding brightness of the massive stage lights, desperately trying to see exactly who had dared to so rudely interrupt his ultimate moment of personal, unmatched glory. The absolute peak height of his monumental toxic hubris had successfully been reached. Now, the catastrophic, humiliating fall he rightfully deserved was finally here, entirely ready to completely consume his life in front of everyone tonight. The glorious illusion was over, and the bitter reality had arrived. Through the massive, wide-open doorway, the cool draft from the lobby swept into the stifling perfume, heavy air of the ballroom. I stepped over the threshold, completely ignoring the collective gasp that rippled through the hundreds of elite guests. I was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored white power suit that fit me with absolute precision. The crisp, structured lines of the jacket and the immaculate flowing cut of the trousers were chosen specifically to radiate authority and uncompromising dominance. My heels clicked with sharp, rhythmic finality against the polished marble floor. I did not look like a discarded, broken ex-wife seeking pathetic revenge. I looked like an executioner arriving to collect a long-overdue debt. The sea of wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites instinctively parted before me, creating a wide, clear path straight down the center of the room toward the brightly lit stage. The whispers started immediately buzzing through the crowd like a disturbed hive of hornets. People leaned in close to one another, pointing discreetly, their eyes wide with hungry curiosity. They recognized me from the years I spent quietly standing in the background at Darius's corporate events, but they had never seen me command a room with such terrifying confidence. The mayor of Atlanta stopped mid-sentence, completely abandoning his conversation to stare at my arrival. Press photographers instinctively raised their heavy cameras, sensing a massive shift in the meticulously planned narrative. But the whispers about my sudden appearance were absolutely nothing compared to the shockwave of pure, unadulterated disbelief that struck the room seconds later. The truly devastating blow had not yet entered the bright light. I paused a few feet inside the ballroom and turned my head slightly toward the open doorway. Following my silent cue, a second figure emerged from the shadows of the lobby and stepped fully into the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. It was Loretta. There was no motorized wheelchair. There was no medical cane. There was no vacant, pitiful stare of a woman broken by a severe neurological stroke. My mother-in-law walked into that grand ballroom with the rigid, flawless posture of a reigning queen. She was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald green evening gown that caught the light with every single confident step she took. Her hair was perfectly styled, framing her sharp, incredibly intelligent face. And most terrifying of all to the people standing on that stage, she was wearing 3-inch designer heels, walking with a smooth, completely unhindered grace that defied every single lie Darius had told about her health. The silence in the grand ballroom deepened, becoming so heavy and absolute that it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. The live orchestra members were frozen in their seats, their bows suspended over their violins. The hundreds of guests were completely paralyzed, their eyes darting rapidly back and forth between the regal, powerful woman walking beside me and the arrogant man standing frozen on the stage. Up on the elevated platform, the illusion of Darius's untouchable empire shattered in real time. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped completely through his suddenly numb fingers. It hit the hard acrylic surface of the podium and plummeted down to the wooden stage floor, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The loud crash of the breaking glass was the only sound in the entire room, echoing loudly through the microphone. Darius stared at his mother, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish, completely incapable of forming a single coherent word. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, cornered animal. Down in the front row, VIP section, the reaction was even more violently visceral. Tasha, who had been aggressively mocking my supposed misery just moments before, inhaled sharply at the exact moment she took a large gulp of her champagne. The alcoholic liquid went straight down her windpipe. She began to violently choke her face, turning a bright, alarming shade of purple as she coughed uncontrollably, spilling the sticky drink all over the front of her expensive designer dress. Jamal frantically dropped his own glass and started slamming his heavy hand against her back, but his eyes were completely locked on Loretta. His massive shoulders slumped, and his entire muscular frame began to visibly tremble. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew the paralyzed woman he had brutally assaulted in my apartment was a complete fiction, which meant every single violent threat he made had been heard and absorbed by a highly conscious, fully capable matriarch. Vanessa grabbed the edge of the podium to steady herself, her fake glowing smile instantly replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She looked at Darius desperately, waiting for him to take control of the situation, but he was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own horrific miscalculation. Chloe dropped her cell phone onto the floor, staring at the grandmother she had actively ignored for the past 3 months. Loretta and I walked slowly down the center aisle, our synchronized footsteps echoing loudly in the silent room. We did not rush. We let the suffocating tension build with every single second that passed. We let the elite crowd fully absorb the undeniable reality standing right in front of them. The wealthy investors who had just eagerly applauded Darius's so-called self-made success were now staring at the true owner of the land, realizing they had been completely lied to. When we finally reached the edge of the stage, we stopped. Loretta looked up at her son. She did not display an ounce of maternal warmth. She looked at him with the cold, calculating detachment of a judge preparing to deliver a final devastating sentence. Darius finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. The sheer terror in his eyes was rapidly replaced by a desperate, explosive, and completely unhinged rage. He realized his entire carefully crafted public image was actively disintegrating in front of the mayor and the press. He aggressively shoved the microphone stand out of his way and stormed heavily down the short flight of stairs, leading off the stage, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "Security!" Darius roared at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. "I want security in here right now. Throw these women out of my building immediately. They are trespassing on a private corporate event." 2 massive security guards stationed near the catering tables immediately stepped forward, their hands reaching for the radios clipped to their belts. But before they could take another step toward us, Loretta simply turned her head and pinned them with a single terrifying glare. "If either of you takes one more step toward me, I will personally ensure you are both named as co-conspirators in the federal fraud indictment that is about to dismantle this entire company," Loretta stated, her voice slicing through the heavy air with absolute, undeniable authority. The 2 guards instantly froze in their tracks, looking nervously between the furious CEO and the incredibly powerful woman standing beside me. They slowly backed away, completely unwilling to risk their own freedom for a man who was clearly unraveling. Darius stopped right in front of me, his chest heaving aggressively. His face was a mask of pure, desperate hatred. "What do you think you are doing, Charmaine?" he hissed viciously, keeping his voice low enough that the crowd could not hear, though the nearby investors were leaning in hungrily to catch every single spoken word. You think you can just march in here and ruin my magnificent night? You are nothing. My mother is a sick, confused old woman, and you manipulated her into coming here today. You are completely insane, and I am going to permanently destroy you for this. I did not flinch. I did not back away. I looked him dead in the eyes, feeling a profound, absolute sense of calm wash over me. I was no longer the quiet, compliant wife who managed his messes behind closed doors. I was the architect of his total destruction. You destroyed yourself, Darius, I replied smoothly, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional reaction to his childish tantrum. I simply provided the necessary legal documentation. I stepped gracefully around him, completely ignoring his aggressive posture. I walked purposefully toward the side of the stage, heading straight for the complex audio-visual control desk, where a terrified-looking technician was sitting behind a massive glowing soundboard and a laptop connected to the giant projector screens. Darius spun around, his eyes widening in fresh panic as he realized exactly where I was going. "Stop her!" Darius screamed, lunging forward, but Loretta stepped directly into his path, effectively blocking him from reaching me. He stumbled slightly, entirely unwilling to physically shove his own mother in front of a dozen flashing press cameras. I reached the control desk. The technician stared up at me, completely unsure of what to do. I reached into the front pocket of my tailored white jacket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. It contained the meticulously compiled evidence of their crimes, expertly formatted for maximum public exposure. I firmly pushed the technician's hand away from his laptop and plugged the flash drive directly into the main USB port. I bypassed the security prompts with practiced efficiency, instantly overriding the standard corporate slideshow that had been playing on a loop. I reached out and grabbed the spare wireless microphone resting on the edge of the desk. I turned back to face the massive crowd of investors, politicians, and media members. Darius was still struggling to get past his mother, his face red and sweaty, screaming for someone to cut the main power to the ballroom. He frantically waved at the remaining security team across the room. But the federal agents had already quietly secured the outer perimeter of the doors. I held the microphone up to my mouth, ensuring my voice would echo through every single corner of the lavish space. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my tone completely steady and commanding. "Darius just gave you a truly beautiful, inspiring speech about how he built this massive real estate empire with his own bare hands. He told you he was a self-made titan. I think your investors would like to see the real foundation of your empire, Darius." I pressed a single button on the laptop. Instantly, the massive 30-foot projector screens that had been displaying shiny architectural renderings of the Midtown complex went completely black. A split second later, a high-resolution image flashed across the displays. It was the $6,000 check. The blue ink of Darius's signature was magnified to the size of a luxury vehicle. Right next to the check, the text of the Loretta Family Irrevocable Trust appeared, specifically highlighting the morality and guardianship clause in bright red letters. I looked out at the sea of wealthy investors and politicians. "The man standing before you did not build his company with his own money," I announced, my voice echoing clearly. "Every single commercial property he claims to own, including the land for the new Midtown complex, belongs entirely to the Loretta Family Irrevocable Trust. My mother-in-law graciously allowed him to use her land as collateral, but the trust had one strict, unbreakable rule. If the primary beneficiary ever committed an act of elder abandonment, he would automatically forfeit his entire inheritance." I gestured up toward the massive screens. 14 days ago, during our divorce settlement, Darius officially documented his refusal to care for the woman who gave him life. He wrote me a check for $6,000 and explicitly wrote that he was paying me to take his burdensome mother off his hands. By legally documenting his abandonment, Darius instantly triggered the morality clause. He was entirely stripped of his beneficiary status. He does not own the Midtown property. He does not own the Buckhead mansion. He does not own a single brick of his so-called empire. He owns absolutely nothing. A collective, horrifying gasp swept through the ballroom. The wealthy angel investors who had just pledged millions of dollars to his firm began muttering in panicked, angry tones. The mayor quickly stepped away from the stage, instantly distancing himself from the toxic fallout. Darius stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, his face completely devoid of color. "That is a lie," he stammered, his voice weak and trembling without a microphone. "I signed the federal release forms this morning. The bank approved the $50 million transfer. The money is in my accounts. You cannot take my company away from me, Charmaine. I am the CEO." I smiled coldly. "You are right, Darius. You did sign the federal release forms this morning, but since you lost the rights to the trust 2 weeks ago, you pledged collateral that you did not legally own. That is federal bank fraud. And worse, the signature on the release forms you handed to the First Federal Bank of Georgia was completely forged." I tapped the keyboard again. The image of the check vanished immediately, replaced by the crystal-clear high-definition security footage from my apartment. The live audio from the video pumped through the expensive ballroom speakers. The entire elite crowd watched in absolute disgusted horror as the massive frame of Jamal kicked open my front door. They heard the violent threats. They saw Jamal violently shove me to the floor, and then the camera zoomed in perfectly on Tasha. The crowd watched as she aggressively grabbed her paralyzed mother's hand, forcing her fingers around the pen, violently dragging the ink across the official bank documents. The ballroom erupted into sheer pandemonium. Investors started shouting angrily. Reporters frantically snapped photos of the massive screens capturing the undeniable evidence of the violent felony. Jamal stumbled backward in the VIP section, bumping into a catering table and sending a tray of expensive champagne glasses crashing to the floor. He raised his hands to his head, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Tasha stood completely paralyzed, the sticky champagne she had choked on earlier still dripping down the front of her expensive designer dress. She looked around at the wealthy socialites who were now staring at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Right on cue, the heavy doors at the back and sides of the ballroom burst open. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across the back swarmed into the room. They moved with swift tactical precision, immediately securing all the exits and marching purposefully toward the stage. Special Agent Thompson took the lead, holding up a thick stack of blue folders. "Nobody moves," Thompson commanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the chaotic shouting. "Darius Vance, Jamal Hayes, and Tasha Hayes, you are all under arrest for federal bank fraud, conspiracy, aggravated assault, and elder abuse." Darius stumbled backward, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He looked frantically around the room, realizing there was absolutely no escape. His eyes darted to Vanessa, who was standing completely still near the podium. Darius scrambled up the stairs, desperately grabbing her arm. "Vanessa," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "Listen to me. We can fix this. I know the best defense attorneys in the state. We will fight the charges. We will rebuild everything. You and me, we can start over." Vanessa looked at his desperate, sweating face. She looked down at his hands, gripping her arm, then looked out at the federal agents rapidly approaching the stage. She saw the empire she had intentionally gotten pregnant to secure completely vanishing into thin air. Her guaranteed life of luxury, the private schools, the designer clothes, everything was gone. She violently shoved Darius away with both hands, her face twisting into a mask of pure, selfish survival. "Get your hands off me, you pathetic loser!" Vanessa screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing shrilly through the microphone on the podium. "I am not going to federal prison for you. I had nothing to do with any of this. I did not forge any documents." Darius stared at her, completely heartbroken by the instant betrayal. "But Vanessa, we are a family. We are having a baby together." Vanessa let out a harsh, hysterical laugh that sounded completely unhinged. "A baby. You really think I wanted to tie myself to a broke, arrogant fool who cannot even keep his own company afloat?" She pointed a manicured finger directly at his face. "This is not even your baby, Darius." The entire ballroom went completely silent again, the sheer drama of the moment freezing everyone in place. Even the federal agents slowed their approach, letting the catastrophic implosion finish. Darius blinked rapidly, completely unable to process the words. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa sneered, pointing a shaking finger down into the VIP section, aiming directly at the massive sweating contractor standing next to his horrified wife. "I have been sleeping with Jamal for the last 8 months. Vanessa screamed, completely throwing every single person under the bus to save herself. Jamal is the father. He promised me he was going to take over your commercial contracts and build his own empire. You are just a stupid, gullible stepping stone. The silence shattered instantly. Tasha let out an inhuman, blood-curdling shriek. The absolute betrayal of learning her husband had impregnated her brother's mistress broke the final thread of her sanity. She lunged forward with terrifying speed, her hands extended like claws. She scrambled up the stage stairs, completely ignoring the federal agents, and threw herself directly at Vanessa. Tasha tackled the pregnant mistress to the hard wooden floor. They rolled across the stage, screaming and pulling hair, knocking over the heavy acrylic podium and sending the microphone skidding across the floor with a loud shriek of audio feedback. Jamal tried to run toward the stage to stop the violent brawl, but Special Agent Reynolds immediately tackled his massive frame to the ground, forcefully pressing his face into the polished marble floor and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his thick wrists. Darius simply fell to his knees in the center of the stage. He did not try to stop his sister from attacking his mistress. He did not try to run from the federal agents. He just knelt there in his expensive custom tuxedo, surrounded by the shattered pieces of his crystal champagne flute, watching his entire life burn to the ground. Chloe stood trembling near the front row. The massive designer bag Vanessa had bought her slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Her entire teenage world of superficial luxury and endless allowances had just violently exploded into federal indictments and massive public humiliation. She stared at the man she had proudly chosen over her own mother, finally seeing him not as a wealthy hero, but as a completely pathetic, broken criminal who had lost absolutely everything in seconds because of his own uncontrollable and deeply selfish arrogance. I stood calmly at the audiovisual desk, watching the total magnificent chaos erupt all around me. Loretta walked over and stood quietly by my side. She did not gloat. She simply watched her son face the ultimate devastating consequences of his own boundless greed. The agents moved with swift efficiency. Agent Thompson pulled Darius up by his tuxedo collar, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollowed out. He was entirely stripped of his arrogant aura. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Jamal was hauled up next, trembling violently as Reynolds read his Miranda rights. As the men were marched down the aisle, press photographers descended like vultures. Camera flashes illuminated Darius's pale face. He tried to duck his head, attempting to shield himself from the digital documentation of his disgrace, but there was nowhere to hide. The media outlets he invited to broadcast his victory were now capturing his humiliating perp walk. Tasha remained on stage, completely hysterical. She sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her ruined designer dress. Her life of stolen wealth had evaporated, leaving her facing multiple federal indictments for forgery. Vanessa was backed into a corner by two federal agents. She frantically tried negotiating a desperate immunity deal on the spot, loudly offering to testify against Darius and Jamal in exchange for her own personal freedom. There was absolutely no honor among these miserable thieves. They were actively tearing each other apart the exact moment the ship finally began to sink. Amidst the swirling chaos of flashing cameras and shouting politicians, my eyes locked onto a small, trembling figure near the front row of the VIP section. It was Chloe. The heavy Prada bag she proudly flaunted at the law firm 2 weeks ago had slipped from her hands, lying abandoned on the polished marble floor. Her expensive cocktail dress suddenly looked ridiculous on her shaking frame. I walked slowly away from the audiovisual desk, stepping around the shattered glass and discarded champagne flutes. Loretta stayed behind, allowing me to approach my daughter alone. As I got closer, Chloe looked up at me. The cold, entitled mask Darius and Vanessa had so carefully molded over her teenage face was entirely gone. She looked incredibly young, terrified, and profoundly broken. She had just watched her father, the man who bought her loyalty with luxury cars and unlimited credit cards, exposed as a ruthless, manipulative criminal who was willing to abandon his own mother for a piece of real estate. She had just heard her future stepmother scream about a sordid affair with her uncle. The toxic illusion she had chosen over me was completely destroyed. "Mom, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking under the heavy weight of her realization. Hot tears began spilling down her cheeks, ruining her carefully applied makeup. I stopped right in front of her. I did not speak immediately. I needed her to fully feel the absolute gravity of this monumental moment. "I am so sorry," Chloe sobbed, her entire body shaking, as she finally understood the horrific magnitude of her father's true character. "You were right. You were right about everything. I was so stupid. I let him buy me. I let them turn me against you. Dad is a monster. I am so incredibly sorry, Mom. Please forgive me. Please do not leave me here." She took a desperate step forward, completely abandoning the superficial pride she had carried for months. I looked into her tear-filled eyes. It is the absolute hardest thing in the world to discipline a child who has been poisoned against you, but it is equally difficult to watch them realize the painful truth about a parent they idolized. But this pain was necessary. It was the crucial first step in breaking the cycle of toxic manipulation that had infected this family for decades. I reached out and wrapped my arms tightly around my daughter. I pulled her close, pressing her head against my shoulder. Chloe completely collapsed into my embrace, weeping loudly into the fabric of my white suit. "I am right here, Chloe," I said softly, gently stroking her hair. "I am not going anywhere. We have a lot of hard work to do, and we have a lot to rebuild. But you are going to learn how to live in reality now. You are going to learn the actual value of honesty, loyalty, and hard work. I love you, and we are going to be okay." It was the genuine beginning of a very long, difficult healing process. But for the first time in over a year, I was holding my real daughter again, completely free from her father's venomous influence. 6 months later, the charity gala felt like a distant fever dream. The federal penitentiary doors had slammed shut behind Darius and Jamal. Both men had pled guilty to massive federal bank fraud and conspiracy charges after realizing the high-definition video evidence was entirely insurmountable. Darius was sentenced to 15 years. Jamal received 10. Tasha managed to avoid prison time by completely cooperating with the authorities, but she was hit with massive financial restitution penalties that forced her into a life of crushing debt and minimum wage labor. Vanessa had vanished from Atlanta entirely, fleeing to another state to raise a child that would never see a single dime of the real estate fortune she had so desperately schemed to steal. As for me, my surroundings had changed drastically. I was no longer sitting in a modest apartment or working out of a small consultancy office. I was sitting comfortably behind a massive custom-built mahogany desk on the top floor of a stunning glass skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. I was officially the chief executive officer of the newly restructured Loretta Family Trust and its massive real estate development subsidiary. The transition of power had been swift and legally flawless. After Darius's arrest, the First Federal Bank of Georgia immediately called in his loans and seized his corporate entities. But because I held the absolute controlling interest in the commercial land, acting as the foundation for those entities, I easily stepped in, assumed the manageable debt, and legally absorbed the entire $50 million Midtown project. I was now managing the empire legally, ethically, and brilliantly. We were using permitted high-quality materials. We were paying our contractors fairly. We were building something that would actually last. I looked across my expansive office. Sitting comfortably on a plush leather sofa bathed in the warm afternoon sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows was Loretta. She was wearing a beautiful floral blouse, sipping a cup of expensive herbal tea and reading a paperback novel. There was color in her cheeks and a bright, peaceful light in her eyes. She was thoroughly enjoying her healthy, wealthy, and completely unburdened retirement. She looked up from her book, caught my eye, and offered a warm, genuine smile. I smiled back at her, feeling a profound sense of absolute fulfillment. I turned my attention to the panoramic view of the bustling city skyline spread out beneath my window. The massive steel cranes of the Midtown project were visible in the distance, actively building the future I now controlled. Society often conditions women to believe that when a marriage violently collapses, we must quietly fade into the background. We are told to accept the meager crumbs thrown our way, to mourn the loss of our status, and to shrink ourselves down to accommodate the massive egos of the men who betrayed us. Darius expected me to break. He expected me to cry over a $6,000 check and disappear into a life of quiet, pathetic obscurity. He severely underestimated the quiet, calculating strength of a woman who knows her exact worth. The most powerful weapon you can ever possess in this life is not a loud voice, a threatening posture, or a history of brute force. The most powerful weapon is a sharp, disciplined intellect. It is the ability to read the fine print, to understand the leverage you hold, and to remain completely calm while your enemies dig their own graves with their unbridled arrogance. I did not have to raise my voice or throw a single punch to destroy the monsters who tortured my family. I simply let them put their greed in writing, and the law did the rest. True revenge is never about matching their toxic violence. The ultimate undeniable revenge is absolute unbothered success. It is taking the shattered pieces of the life they tried to destroy and building an empire so high they can never reach you again. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my story. If you have ever had to fight back against deeply narcissistic family members, or if you have ever used your intelligence to outsmart a bully, please let me know your story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel for more stories of justice, resilience, and ultimate triumph. Remember, your worth is never determined by how poorly someone else treats you. Stay smart, stay incredibly strong, and never be afraid to completely own your truth.